It's great to be here at Green College. This building has a special place in my heart because it was only a few years ago that I was married here to my lovely wife, Jane Gowan, and some of her friends and family are here today. So we got married right out there, and then Jane and I gave toasts right exactly here. So this feels a little strange to be back here. But I'm glad to be here, and my presentation, maybe not on such a romantic topic, but one that I'm still very passionate about. So I think, most people assume we're going to begin here, right, with Edward Snowden and the NSA revelations, but actually I'm not really going to begin here. I'll just say quickly about all of this. June 5th was the first Edward Snowden revelation, and there's been probably about one a week that has come out on the front page of The Guardian or the New York Times or one of the other media outlets, some kind of revelation, and it's extraordinary for somebody like me, first of all, and Steve. To see this coming out and to have conversations in the open about some of these programs is absolutely astonishing. And the fact that they're coming out once a week makes it very difficult to actually keep up and follow. It's becoming overwhelming, and there are some sites that provide archives. Thank goodness for that. It's the biggest intelligence leak in history, that's for sure. I've heard estimates, those who know the volume of the documents that were taken by Edward Snowden and released, that if we were to continue with releases at this rate, that it would take 46 years before all of the documents are reported on. So he took a lot with him, and there's a lot more to come. What do we know from it so far? Well, there used to be a kind of, a suspicion among many people who were probably labeled paranoid that the NSA is collecting everything. Well, it is true. That's at least their ambition. People ask me, are you surprised about this program or that program? Not so much. Maybe I didn't know the exact details or the code names, but the audaciousness of it, collecting everything from the fiber optic cables to metadata to cellular phone traffic. It's really quite extraordinary. And it, of course, raises huge questions about privacy oversight around our own signals intelligence agency, CSEC here, Snowden's motivations, Russia's involvement. People are debating about all of that. But notwithstanding the importance of this, I'm going to start actually somewhere else, the other side of the world, in Pakistan. So Pakistan, country, does have its own intelligence agency, but minuscule, a fraction of the resources and capabilities of the NSA. It's a country with a lot of troubles, insurgencies, militancy, issues around religious fundamentalism. It's one of the world's worst places for human rights abuses and limits on free expression. In 2013, I think there are several dozen journalists who were killed or detained by security forces. It's also one of the world's worst censors of the internet. So if you're in Pakistan, you don't have the same internet as we do here in Canada. For example, most human rights information is blocked in Pakistan. Anything to do with LGBT issues are blocked in Pakistan. All of YouTube is blocked entirely, so you can't get access to YouTube. And, when did this happen? Well, a couple of years ago, they put out this tender as a bid for a request for proposals from companies saying, we want to create a nationwide filtering system in Pakistan. And it was actually had very sophisticated components. Like if you look at this, those of you who can't see in the back, there's one of the requirements is that the system that is contracted out needs to be able to block list up to 50 million URLs, concurrent unidirectional filtering capacity, with a processing delay of not more than 1 millisecond. So that's, we're talking about a pretty big capacity here. It's not something that likely Pakistan engineers could do for themselves. So, of course, everyone in the kind of community that Steve and I belong to immediately thought, okay, this is going to be bad. A Western company is going to, get the contract for this. So there was actually an advocacy campaign that was started. a letter writing campaign to a lot of the big companies that provide filtering technology, and it actually worked. Some of the companies came out and said, okay, we're not going to go ahead because of human rights concerns and bid for this contract. So here you see one such company, McAfee, which is the producer of a smart filter. They're an American company, and they tweeted actually saying, yeah, we're not going to go and do this in Pakistan. But ahead it went anyway, and everyone was scratching their heads wondering, well, who is the company that did this? So if you're in Pakistan, you try to access, you know, something to do with human rights issues, you'd likely come across a block page like this. So at the Citizen Lab, one of the things that we do, one of the projects we have, is to investigate and actually fingerprint the companies that provide this type of technology. And the way we do it is a combination of forensic technical methods involving computer engineers that work in Toronto in the lab, but also research that's done by partners in places like Pakistan. Some of them run tests for us using technical tools that we give them, and they also do contextual research. Obviously, in a place like Pakistan, that could be quite risky. But we started our research in Pakistan once the filtering system was in place, and we had our Pakistani colleagues run technical tests, and the forensic people in Toronto got the data, analyzed it. And what we noticed is in the source code for the block page, there was this, and this is like, in many ways, a digital fingerprint if you know where to look. So we have all of the user guides of all of the censorship technologies, and we went and we saw that, you know, this actually mirrors exactly the code that is laid out in the user guide for one particular company. So we knew what the company was at that point based on the source code and some other things, but the way it was configured in Pakistan was kind of clumsy, so there was another way that we could find out the company, and that's by visiting the IP address directly of the block page, and it actually gave us the login of the company for the filtering. So we could see from that very clearly in several instances the name of the company is actually NetSweeper. For those of you who don't know, this is a Canadian company based in Guelph, Ontario, NetSweeper. So we were able to identify the company. Of course, we released our report. It did make some news here in Canada, Globe and Mail, National Post, Toronto Star, and so on. So there was some coverage in the papers, but not much else. Then our partners in Pakistan, we don't do advocacy at the Citizen Lab. We don't do things like open media, you know, petitions and that sort of thing. We're a research group. But a lot of our partners, especially local partners, do that sort of thing. So in Pakistan, they started an advocacy campaign. They actually started a legal case in Lahore High Court. And they went to petition a judge to stop this from happening as a violation of human rights in Pakistan. And the attorney on the government side said, this is all made up. There is no such thing as this University of Toronto group, and this report is made up by these crazy, you know, people who are, you know, engaging in blasphemy. And the judge, who was quite a liberal-minded judge, he had a computer and he actually Googled Citizen Lab and he said, no, I can see the report on their page right here, so we know that they're actually a group, which is quite funny. But they also, interestingly, wrote a letter to the Canadian High Commissioner in Canada saying, hey, what's up with this? You know, Canada, Canadian company supplying the, you know, internet censorship in Pakistan, what do you think about that? And, you know, for those of you who follow this area, if there's a Canadian foreign policy about cyberspace at all, it's sort of all the good things, right? You know, we're for human rights, free expression, access to information. And remarkably, the High Commissioner responded to our partners, and here's the actual letter they sent. But there's a really interesting clause, which down here, for those of you who can't see in the back, basically they say, you know, all the boilerplate stuff, we're all for human rights, free expression, but the use of such information technologies in Pakistan is the responsibility of the government of Pakistan to manage in accordance with local law. So basically here the Canadian government is washing their hands of it. They're saying, yeah, you know, it's Pakistan's issue, let them deal with it. So our own government is kind of sticking its head in the sand about it, which at the very least is contradictory, right? You can't say those things and then, you know, about, well, we need a set of global standards for human rights, but then on the other hand say, well, it's up to local governments to do whatever the heck they want. And in the absence of a strong Canadian policy, I was thinking if I had time, I'd write an op-ed that would be about, in Toronto we're experiencing this cold right now. It's like this polar vortex. And there's kind of like a cyber foreign policy vortex in Canada, right? So as a consequence of that, you have companies like NetSweeper. By the way, NetSweeper provides the same services to Yemen, Bahrain, and a few other countries like that. So it's kind of notorious for human rights abuse. And that's what you have when you don't have anything to the contrary. Now, this is kind of symptomatic of the things that are concerning me right now that I think should be of concern to all of us. So you have a country here, Pakistan, that is in the global south, whose connectivity to the internet is exploding, like thousands of % a year. People are purchasing and using mobile phones like crazy. If you visit Pakistan, it's like really vibrant culture. But the government is basically a failed state. It's pretty much a corrupt, autocratic regime that has many security challenges, serious insurgencies. So cybersecurity is a big concern. They also have, obviously, religious sensitivities. So they're putting in place a national cybersecurity strategy that includes basically carving up the internet. And it's being done through very advanced commercial technology manufactured by a Canadian company. And so this is kind of a microcosm of what's brewing on the horizon right now. There's a kind of degradation of the communications environment occurring that's analogous to the degradation of the natural environment. And that's certainly what I'm interested in and what we're interested in at the Citizen Lab. For those of you who don't know, the Citizen Lab was founded at the Munk School of Global Affairs in 2001. It's an unusual place. We employ a mixed methods approach, and by that I mean that we combine the skills of computer scientists, engineers, with lawyers and social scientists, people all over the world with whom we collaborate, like our partners in Pakistan. We've uncovered global cyber espionage networks, as Steve talked about. We've documented growing patterns of internet censorship for the last 10 years all over the world. Now more than 70 countries engage in internet censorship. So we've kind of been like a digital early warning system, scanning the horizon, and what we've seen has really been troubling. So what I want to do today in my talk is outline what I see as some of the troubling elements, outline the observations that I have about how cyberspace is being degraded, much like the natural environment is being degraded, and then talk about what to do about it. And here I think university research of the sort that the Citizen Lab does and has been engaged in is actually critical to prevent and reverse that degradation. So I hope there will become more Citizen Labs, if you will. So I'm going to begin with some big observations about the changing nature of cyberspace. And first you have to start with, the domain that we're talking about itself. It's not fixed. It's always in flux. And I think right now we're in the midst of a major shift. Best way I can think of describing it is like a social media supernova explosion. And it's a pretty bold thing to say that we're going through a revolution in communications, perhaps the biggest in human history. If you think about like the printing press, television, that would be a bold claim, but I do believe we're going through one of the most important, just really within the last 5 to 10 years, with the widespread use of three things really: social media, Facebook, Twitter, all of that, cloud computing, and mobile connectivity. Those three together. What do they share in common? Well, really one thing, one characteristic, and that's the amount of private data, personal information, that used to be in our desktops or filing cabinets or in our heads, which is now shared with third parties outside of us. And most of those third parties are private companies. And they're private companies, many of which exist in another jurisdiction than our own, than those within which we are citizens. Now, this includes not just the information that we're conscious of and deliberate about, like, for example, emails that we send or tweets that we send, all of that as well, but a lot more, too, that we are unaware of, that follows us around like a digital trail. And I think the best example of this is metadata, which is the tag, the envelope to all of the content of the communications. So best example is my mobile phone. I'm sure everyone in the room has one. Even when I'm not using it, it's emitting a pulse as a beacon to the nearest Wi-Fi router or cell phone tower. And in that beacon is information on the make and model of the phone, the fact that it's my phone, my name is attached to my phone, the operating system on the phone, and also, most importantly, the geolocation of the phone. So all of you probably have a phone in your pocket as well that's doing the same thing right now. And that data, we're not even using our phones right now, doesn't just evaporate into the ether, it doesn't just go off into the skies. It actually sits on the servers of the companies that own and operate all of the physical infrastructure. And that's just the mobile phone, right, itself. Most of us inside our mobile phones have several dozen applications, each of which do the very same thing, right? Extract data from our phones. Some of them give themselves permission to extract all the information about all of the contacts in your address book. And they remove that information and they send them to servers. So all of that information about our communications, our location, our social networks, our photographs, sits on the servers of computers, archived perhaps indefinitely, there to be shared and potentially mined. Steve mentioned the Internet of Things, and this is extraordinary. You really can't underestimate this because it's taking everything that I just talked about and it's exploding in even more multi-dimensions. So we're essentially turning our lives inside out, our digital lives. And I'll talk more about that later. Steve also mentioned that it creates enormous security risks, which leads to the next big observation that I have about cyberspace, and that's the growing power and role of states. So here you have to take a bit of a historical perspective. If you go back to the early days of the Internet, say 20 years ago when it was first getting started, most governments had no policies whatsoever about the Internet. Those that did, it was very interesting to note, they took a laissez-faire approach, meaning governments should actually not get involved. It was like a deliberate strategy. Keep the state out. If you remember Al Gore, there's a funny joke about him inventing the Internet, and people would kind of laugh at that. But in fact, there's some merit to that argument because when he was in Congress, he was one of the people that actually set that paradigm in place. You know, keep the government out of the Internet, and it will help spur on innovation and so on. Well, that was in the early days, you know, when engineers were running the Internet. It was a small group of like-minded people. But as cyberspace has become more important, embedded in just about everything we do, especially critical infrastructure like hospitals, government networks, and so on, obviously governments are going to get more and more involved. So in hindsight, this was kind of inevitable. And there was a lot of mythologizing about the Internet, that, you know, governments would not be able to control this domain. Well, it was just that they were either ignorant of it or they deliberately took a hands-off approach. But that gradually changed. They became more and more involved. And this was kind of gradual until an important punctuation point, which of course was 9/11. So 9/11, several things change in the wake of that horrific attack. It was really a game changer. First of all, it changed how state intelligence agencies thought about information. So prior to 9/11, for the most part, state intelligence agencies kind of focused on each other. It was like a spy versus spy game. But after 9/11, the threat disperses, right, to non-state actors, and the focus turns inward to all of society, right? And I'll talk more about that in a minute. You also see a culture shift at this time, a kind of all bets off approach in the intelligence community, based on a perception that the reason this catastrophic attack happened was because of a perceived failure to connect the dots, right? Which brings about an urgency to overcome those barriers that separated law enforcement and intelligence agencies and collect a lot of information so that they could precisely connect the dots. And this culture shift includes, as we know now, thanks to Edward Snowden, an almost complete irreverence towards the rule of law. So people in the U.S. intelligence community began to look for ways to not just bend the law, but go beyond it. And we see all sorts of subterfuge around the language that's used to justify it, and quite insidious evasion of the law, I would say. And of course, you had legal changes as well. So you had the Patriot Act and other acts like it passed in other countries that dramatically empower law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And at the same time, just after 9/11, you also have new technological platforms being built at this time, and a shift in the defense industrial base. This graphic, how many people recognize this in the audience? I'm curious. A few people who are really into this area. So this is a proposed program that came out right after 9/11 called Total Information Awareness. And it freaked a lot of people out. If you look at the logo, I mean, look at it. It's like a Masonic temple with the eye and everything. And the idea was that, it sounds actually quite prophetic in many ways, to collect everything, to collect everyone's credit card transactions, phone calls, emails, everything, and turn it over to the government for surveillance purposes. And it actually failed in Congress. It failed to get congressional approval, mostly not only because of the freaky logo, but also because the guy behind it was someone named John Poindexter. How many people know who John Poindexter is? So if those of you who remember the Iran-Contra affair, John Poindexter was at the heart of that. And so that also freaked people out. You have this dubious person behind a freaky-looking program that wants to collect all our never passed Congress. Well, what happened was, as we now know, again thanks to Edward Snowden, this project wasn't actually killed. Instead, it was atomized into a number of different projects that were all supported through black budget. And at this time, you had a huge expansion in the private sector, the number of companies that were contracted through black budgets of the Pentagon. Actually, the best insight into this, if you're interested in that just little slice, the Washington Post had a special series called Top Secret America that was put together by Dana Priest. And it's astonishing. You can go and click through like this and look at different sectors of the government's contracting of these private contractors to do things like provide security. You know, we all know about Blackwater in Iraq. That would be an example. But also things having to do with surveillance, computer network exploitation, and so on. You have tens of billions of dollars going towards developing capabilities like surveillance, big data analytics, offensive computer network attack capabilities, and so on. And to process it all, the NSA also went through this enormous expansion. Part of it was physical as well. This is from their new headquarters that they're building. You mentioned the one CSEC is building in Ottawa. I actually saw that one recently as well. And I flew over this one in Utah. It's extraordinary. They're carving out the edge of a building in Utah, and they're building this huge complex. It has to be so large for all the cooling equipment to store all the data. It's about 1.7 billion. And they call it NSA's cloud, which I think is pretty apt. I mean, the NSA is really unique in terms of its resources, its capabilities, right? Also, its home field advantage, meaning the fact that most of the companies that run the global information infrastructure are headquartered in the United States and thus subject to U.S. law and national security letters. Other countries will attempt to do the same as this, but they'll use different techniques because their resources and capabilities are obviously scaled much differently, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So in terms of growing government role in cyberspace, there's some indicators that we can look at to give evidence of this. So keep in mind, when we talk about this cyberspace, this technological environment that we live in, most of it is owned and operated by private companies like Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and so on. And so in order to police this domain or control it in ways that they want to, they have to enlist the cooperation of the private sector. And if you look at a couple of these companies have begun to release transparency reports. So giving statistics on the number of times that governments make requests to them either to remove information or to turn over user data to law enforcement, to intelligence. And this is from Google's. And one thing you can see is, just the number of requests is growing, right? And actually, if you look at it by country, it might surprise you to find out that the usual suspects that you'd think of, the bad countries that, the bad actors out there are not the ones. The vast majority of requests actually come from liberal democratic countries. And the United States actually is way out in front in terms of the number of requests. And that's just one company's transparency report. Incidentally, the Citizen Lab just started a new project led by Chris Parsons, who's a postdoc at the Citizen Lab, where we sent letters to every major telecommunications company in Canada saying you should start doing transparency reports. So we'll see where that leads. Also, part of the growing role of the state in cyberspace is a military dimension. So in addition to policing the net, governments are building up warfare capabilities, their armed forces, to fight and win wars in this domain. And so you see throughout the 2000s a redefinition of the internet and the global communications environment by the military, especially in the United States, as a domain. So they now see it as something equal to land, sea, air, and space. There's cyberspace now. And of course they developed a new command for it, right? U.S. Cyber Command that was until very recently led by General Keith Alexander, who's also the head of the NSA, right? So states begin to build up weapons and armed forces capabilities to fight and win wars in cyberspace. And a really important Rubicon was crossed in this area with the Stuxnet attack on Iran. So this is where the United States and Israel, in their armed forces, developed a very advanced malicious software program that they inserted in the Iranian nuclear enrichment computers, and it caused a sabotage and a major setback to that enrichment program. But of course, other governments quickly take notice of this, and we now have a very real arms race in cyberspace. Dozens of governments have cyber commands or armed forces dedicated to doing things like this, and obviously that raises, when you talk about Internet of Things, and you have countries developing capacities to disrupt and destroy that, and an arms race happening, that gets pretty scary. Now, if you look at those two forces together, the super social media explosion that's going on and the growing role of the state, the two are kind of creating they're generating together a huge and growing market, what I've called the cybersecurity industrial complex, right? And they're very similar in many ways. On the one hand, you have part of the market oriented around trying to determine and shape consumer preferences, right? What are people interested in? What do they want to buy? Who are their friends, and so on. But part of the market is obviously about connecting the dots to identify security threats. So it's different aims, but entirely overlapping techniques, and in many cases, the very same companies. So for example, companies that provide facial recognition, Israeli companies are the best at it. In fact, Google recently purchased an Israeli facial recognition company that got its start in the security area, right? So you have many, many companies like that. Part of it involves diving into network traffic to more carefully discriminate where packets are going. And part of the market is more nefarious. It's about tracking people, getting inside their computers, cell phone tracking, social media infiltration. The weapons around this area are getting more and more refined. The surveillance capabilities are getting more and more sophisticated. And I'll speak more about this growing market later. So in a nutshell, this is where you have, if you will, big data meeting big brother, right? That's where they come together. So just to pause for a second here and think about this historically, at the very same time that we're in the midst of this huge transformation in communication technologies, turning our digital lives inside out, the world's most powerful surveillance machinery is turning inwards on all of us. A surveillance machine whose overarching intention is to actually shield itself from public scrutiny and to barely acknowledge its own existence, to operate in a cloak of secrecy. To me, that's extraordinary, and it's something that deserves a conversation on the order of like a new social contract. We certainly haven't had that in this country. It's maybe starting to happen in the United States. There's another big force going on in cyberspace that I find people, at least in Canada, the United States, are largely unaware of, and that's the fact that the who of the internet is changing really, really fast. So the United States, engineers in North America, Europe may have built the cyberspace, but now they make up a very small proportion of who actually uses it. The vast majority of users of cyberspace, who makes up cyberspace, come from the global south. So if you look at Asia, for example, it comprises, I think, about 45%, 46% of the entire internet population in the world. But by region, it ranks 6th in terms of connectivity, almost near the bottom. Africa is at the bottom. That means that in Asia, it's growing extraordinarily fast, already the world's largest by region, and only 1/6 of the region is connected. So you have this huge growth going on in the developing world. Now, the scary thing is, it's happening in a context of failed, fragile states, authoritarian regimes, countries and populations with huge sensitivities around religious issues, which play a more important role in governance. Why is this important for us? Really because of one thing: the future of the communications environment that we live in will not be determined by all of us in this room. It will be determined by choices that are made there. It will begin to affect the technology, which will in turn impact what we can do and the choices that we have. And remember, these countries are entering into cyberspace at a much different historical context. They're entering into it after the Snowden revelations with the NSA knowledge in mind, right? You think about that. At a time when cybersecurity is at the top of the international agenda, and when products and services of extraordinary sophistication are putting into the hands of policymakers capabilities to engage in censorship, surveillance, and so on. So most of these countries, although they'll definitely want to develop something like the NSA, they won't have the resources or capabilities. They won't follow the same playbook. What are we seeing? Well, in our research, we found that many of the countries actually look to the underworld of cybercrime for an advantage, right? Instead of contracting out, they'll look to employ people or benefit from the underworld of cybercrime for purposes of espionage and warfare. Many of them will seek to duplicate U.S. practices, and they'll use it as a legitimation for what they're doing. So in India, for example, just a couple of weeks ago, they announced that they're going to put in place something called a central monitoring system, which is going to monitor all emails, all communications traffic, and they're going to actually look to the U.S. to help them do it. Just a couple days ago, January 21st, China and Iran sat down, and Iran is contracting with China to help them build a closed national internet. And for China, part of this is actually an economic motivation. So there's a political component too, but an economic motivation for them. Chinese companies, of course, want to enter into new markets, and China is exporting surveillance and censorship equipment all over the world that helps countries build their own surveillance regimes. And this is beginning to affect the product. So in our research, I'll give you one example. We have a project called Asia Chats, China Chats, where we've been looking at instant messaging clients and applications in China. And we looked in particular at the version of Skype in China, TomSkype, and researchers at the lab reverse engineered the client of TomSkype over a period of 18 months. And what they found is that on the application of Skype in China, it used to be the case that they would filter out keywords. So if you tried to type in like Tiananmen Square or Falun Gong or something like that, it wouldn't appear. And sometimes it would give you like, you can't use the banned term. But now what we found is that thousands of keywords are pushed to the client on an almost daily basis, depending on current events, that when you type something in, one of these keywords, it triggers surveillance. So from that point on, all of your communications are monitored. And this is something, of course, is not in the end user license agreement, right? We only found it out because we reverse engineered the client. And this is just one example. We have a huge website with all of the keywords and analysis of, because it's Chinese keywords, we had to have somebody who speaks Chinese go through, interpret it all, and we figured out what the events are that trigger the keywords, and it's things like this. This is from last year. Well, one of them was, there was discussion about one of the party leaders, family members was involved in a car crash involving a Ferrari. So any type of communications about the party leadership was considered sensitive. If you typed in any of those keywords from that point on, all of your communications are monitored. So it's beginning to affect the products. These products, there's one chat application has 400 million users called Line that does this. 400 million users, right? That's a big company. There's also an international dynamic to what's going on down there as well. So these countries, like most countries, when they want to do something domestically, they look to find support internationally, right? They go to regional forums, to international organizations, and they get together and they try to set the rules in their favor to legitimize what they want to do at home. So the countries that want to subject the internet to censorship and surveillance and normalize all of that, they try to set the standards at international bodies. This is one such group called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that includes, Russia, Tajikistan, China, and so on. And they've actually been not only coordinating policies around information controls, they've been doing counter-mobilization exercises where they do kind of simulations of what happened in the Arab Spring with people using Twitter and so forth to organize. And they're quite open about it. They publish, this is our exercise to prevent an Arab Spring from happening in our countries. And the unit within their organization that does this is called their Regional Anti-Terror Structure. So they define that type of mobilization as terrorism also. Interestingly, the acronym is RATS, which is kind of interesting. So all of this is leading to a balkanization of the internet, and it's going to get worse in the wake of the Snowden revelations as countries use the excuse of the Snowden revelations to detach from networks and equipment and companies that are associated with the United States and build their own technologies, but that will be the excuse for them to implement all sorts of greater national level controls. I think also we'll see countries developing their own cyber warfare capabilities. And again, this will be much different. U.S. has Cyber Command, General Keith Alexander, people in uniforms and so on. If you want to see what it will look like in the future in the global south in this area, I think there's a couple of good cases. One would be Iran. So if you remember in 2009, there was a social movement that sprang up in Iran called the Green Movement, and it was very much like the Arab Spring. Involved young people using digital technologies, social media. It was dubbed the Twitter revolution, in fact, because of the way that people were using these technologies. But the Iranian government, unlike, say, Egypt and Mubarak, they didn't just shut off the internet. They took very careful countermeasures. They had their own system in place, very much like the NSA, in fact. They went to Nokia, which is a company that was providing cell phone services, and they said, give us all the information about all these people who are organizing. And Nokia just complied. They said, that's local law, kind of like what the Canadian government was saying. It's like the Iranian version of PRISM. And it really put a chill into the Green movement, of course, because those people were immediately arrested, interrogated. If you have access to all of their mobile communications, you know all of their contacts, and the Green movement quickly dissipated. Another example comes from our own research is Syria. So what's going on in Syria right now, I'm sure many of you are following it, very horrific, right? The Syrian opposition is also highly networked. They use social media, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. But the Syrian intelligence is very savvy about that, and they're actually advised by Iranian intelligence as well. And one after another of our reports we've been doing where we get information from Syrian opposition groups, we see that Syrian intelligence using essentially cybercrime malware to infiltrate the social networks of Syrian opposition groups, and then we've seen one after the other of cases of people being identified in this way, arrested, murdered, even aerial strikes by the Syrian Air Force have been targeted using information that's acquired through infiltrating opposition computers in Syria. And so this conflict has shown how those insecurities offline are mirrored in the online world. And I think this is a kind of playbook for autocratic regimes. And ultimately, some of these capabilities may begin to come back and target us in our own critical infrastructure. Another case, actually the most concerning cases for us, are those not involving like Syrian intelligence using cybercrime techniques, but those companies that I talked about from the cyber industrial complex world. Most of them start off by selling their wares to Western intelligence agencies, defense agencies, but that market quickly saturates and they start looking elsewhere. And this is a good example of what happens. So this is an activist, Bahrain activist, who was arrested, and during interrogation he was tortured, and in the interrogation he was presented with transcripts of his own private communications. When he came out, he said, what the heck, how did they have I thought Skype was encrypted or something, right? So he went to Bloomberg reporter, Vernon Silver, and said, could you investigate this? And Vernon came to the Citizen Lab, and so the Citizen Lab's researchers, Morgan, Bill, scary looking guys, well at least Morgan is, really nice guys though, world-class engineers. They reverse engineered the malicious software that they found in his computer, and it came via a spoofed email from a journalist, Melissa Chan, who's actually a real Al Jazeera journalist. So what they did is they spoofed the email. Within the email they put an attachment, and the attachment contained malicious software. Morgan and Bill reverse engineered the software, and in the data that they collected, there's this interesting allusion to FinSpy here. Well, that immediately set off alarm bells for them, because that's the name of a product that's sold by this guy, Martin Munch, and his company Gamma Group, which is headquartered in Britain. They sell very sophisticated spyware to defense, law enforcement, intelligence agencies. Well, in this case, it was obviously sold to the government of Bahrain. Bill and Morgan then did a scan of the signature that they found that the spyware uses, that identifies the spyware when it communicates with the command and control server. And this is, again, another way to fingerprint technologies like this. And what they found out was that actually there are FinSpy servers all over the world. So it's a big market that this Gamma Group has entered into, but also some really troubling countries that you'd have to be concerned about. Turkmenistan, Ethiopia, Malaysia. In Ethiopia, it was being used against an opposition group during an election. I mean, think about Ethiopia. Who would imagine that the Ethiopian government, there's probably barely an internet there to speak of, is using the most sophisticated spyware to infiltrate the opposition prior to an election sold by a British company. So in our research has really only picked at a tiny bit of this growing area. There's a worldwide market now for capabilities, for surveillance, computer network exploitation sold by U.S., Canadian, and European firms to regimes worldwide seeking to limit democratic participation, isolate, identify opposition groups, and infiltrate meddlesome adversaries all over the world. And after the Snowden revelations, of course, this market is going to explode because all of those governments are going to say, we want those capabilities too, and they'll go to their secret services, who will then go to the companies and purchase them. So when you look at this as a whole, to me, it's a pretty bleak picture here. So what started out as this wonderful idea of a kind of agora, a global commons of information where we could connect to each other seamlessly, and no matter where we were in terms of the network, we all accessed and shared the same information. It's kind of like a public commons. It's now being radically subverted through surveillance, censorship, and militarization. And much like the natural environment, I think there's some serious degradation going on here that we have to do something about. So the question is what to do about it. And I just want to end here laying out what I see in terms of the university playing a role here. So there are many things that are going to have to be done if we're going to correct all of this. It's going to take changes here in Canada, in the United States, in terms of more accountability over our intelligence agencies. We need to bring more transparency to the private sector. We're handing over all of this information, and most of us never bother to read the terms of service. We know very little about actually the digital trail that we leave behind us. But I think one that's close to me in terms of steps that we need to take has to come from the university, and the university research as a kind of custodian of the open commons of information and communications. And to understand this here, I think we need to take a bit of a step back and look at things from historical perspective. I believe that we live in a small planet with many shared problems, and to me it's a no-brainer that if we're ever going to solve these problems, it's essential that we need something like the internet, a communications network the world over through which we can exchange and debate ideas. That seems to me a necessity at a bottom level. And I think, with the internet we came close to that, but I think in the future historians will look at our time and say, there's that window where we came very close to having that, but then it all disappeared through censorship, surveillance, and militarization. Universities, I believe, have a special role to prevent this from happening, and they also have perhaps the biggest stake and among the most to lose if it does happen. Universities are the custodians of learning and knowledge transmission, academic freedom. The internet was born out of the university. So I think the university has a special role in making sure that this doesn't happen. And if you look at the Citizen Lab in terms of what we've been doing, I do believe there's a model here that can be followed and provide a way to at least check some of the more worrisome trends that I outlined. First of all, impartial research, I think, is critical. Evidence-based research. When you use advanced research to shed a light on what is going on beneath the surface, and you do it in such a way that you present facts through reproducible research, as the Citizen Lab has done, it is a powerful weapon in favor of transparency and accountability. I think another thing about universities is the fact that you can develop international networks among them. There are universities everywhere, and this is where the idea of swarming comes in. As we have shown through our international collaborations, including presence inside countries around the world, dozens of countries really, it's essential to create checks and balances from below on a global scale. And this is where the swarming comes in. As I said, we need to be able to move in and around and over and through international borders to hold power in check today. And it's a kind of distributed security. We definitely have shown the importance of interdisciplinary methods. And this is a major barrier actually to overcome within the university itself, because university research is organized around disciplinary silos right now. And those themselves are really artificial creations. It's not that long ago when you didn't have divisions into different, sociology, economics, engineering, and so on. And they're kind of artifacts of a different time. I think now we need to overcome those barriers. And there's, of course, lots, it's not easy to do because there's lots of vested interest in keeping things that way. But it's absurd, really. I mean, you have people going through engineering schools, and they may be passionate about these issues, but in their formal training, they have absolutely no introduction to or engagement with social or policy issues. And on the other hand, in the social sciences, you have people who, again, may be interested in this stuff, but absolutely no technical training whatsoever. And then lastly, of course, is independence and academic freedom. And this is really under threat today from a variety of quarters, but it's absolutely essential that we not take it for granted, because we need to be able to speak truth to power, and the universities are the places that are ideally designed to do this from. And I'm just going to end with this quotation here. It's one of my favorite quotations. If you just take a minute, maybe read that. Sorry, I'll get out of the way of the... The whole human memory can be, and probably in a short time will be, made accessible to every individual. It need not be concentrated in any one single place. It need not be vulnerable as a human head or a human heart is vulnerable. It can be reproduced exactly and fully in Peru, China, Iceland, Central Africa, or wherever else seems to afford an insurance against danger and interruption. So it sounds a lot like the internet. Those are not my words, in fact. They were written more than 70 years ago by H.G. Wells in his essay, The World Brain. And when, I'm a big fan of H.G. Wells. And I often think, imagine if Wells were alive today to see how close we have come to accomplishing this vision, only to let it all be carved up and militarized. And I believe universities have a special obligation to make sure that doesn't happen. So I'll end it there and take any questions or hear any comments you have. Thank you very much. I can feel it. Okay. Anybody who wants to make a comment or question, I'm happy to chat. Yes.
That was a wonderful talk, and your graphics are tremendous too. They're very powerful.
Thank you.
I wanted a couple of questions. What can non-university people do, just ordinary citizens? And at one point, I think you mentioned that maybe something like a Royal Commission in Canada would bring it more out of the field. Could you talk about those two aspects, please?
Well, thanks. That's an excellent question. And there are many things citizens can do. I think most obvious to me would be to get involved in and support some of the civil society advocacy organizations that are engaged in raising awareness about these issues. I think they can be a very powerful force for change using these very technologies, in fact. We have a representative from Open Media here who is sponsoring this event. I think they're a great organization, exactly what I'm talking about, but there are others like them as well. I think we should also be holding our politicians accountable. I really have I'm not partisan in any way. I speak to members of parliament from every party, and I went to Ottawa recently, and it's shocking the extent to which these issues are just not on the table. And by that, I don't mean the stuff I'm talking about in Syria, or I can understand how that's not, but the fact that we have our own signals intelligence agency in this country that for many years has been partnered with the NSA and actually has far less oversight than what exists south of the border is really quite shocking to me. And yet, equally shocking is the fact that members of parliament aren't really engaged about it right now. I think that will change very shortly. The first couple of Snowden revelations about Canada I thought were kind of not that dramatic, actually. They certainly didn't surprise me, and I'm not sure they're the type of thing that would cause mass outrage. I think that might change, though, I guess. Well, there's certainly 46 years of documents worth. There's got to be some in Canada out there. I think there's more coming. There's another thing. I think individuals have privacy rights in this country that allow them to make a specific request to any company that operates in Canada. You can say, give me all the data that you collect about me. So you could ask Rogers, you could ask Shaw, whatever your provider is, and say, can you please give me all the data? And I think that would be interesting if you then wrote about it, because the more people understand exactly the volume of what we're talking about, it's one thing to say metadata, but to actually see it in terms of the number of PDFs that you would get back is extraordinary. I think it might be eye-opening for a lot of people who use Facebook to find out, for example, that Facebook retains all of the sentences that you start but then you delete. So, I mean, think about that in terms of just data storage. You know, all my kids who start writing something and then, well, I better not put that because Dad might see it or something. So there are many things that I think citizens can and should do. Yeah. Oh, the Royal Commission. Yeah. So the Royal Commission, I think, it comes from the fact that we are going through a profound social transformation. I mean, this is a no-brainer, really. It's extraordinary. Historically, we've never gone through something like this. If you look at the NSA's Project Traveler, which was about their metadata collection on cell phones, they collect on the order of around 5 billion metadata records on cell phones a day. A day, right? So that should give you some indication just from that one metric of how much data we're secreting as we just go about our daily lives. It creates, it's a new ecosystem. And so at the same time, we do have very real security threats we have to deal with now. The world's a different place. The threat environment has changed. We're not really concerned as we once were about some country on the other side of the planet that's going to lob ballistic missiles at us. We're now concerned about somebody who may, ignite a backpack in a shopping mall or something like that. So those two together, I mean, they raise very real, important challenges. To me, that rises to the threshold of something like a Royal Commission. Of course, the issue is that we're dealing with this on a global scale. And, it's hard to imagine a commission that would have real merit on that level, given the nature of the international system. So is that question back there?
The question was going to be asked, and started answering it. What should have done is given an amazing large review of the concerns. What at an individual level, besides calling out Roger, what can we do? We have to give people just 3 things that they should think about, 2 questions they should ask before they load up an app on their mobile.
Right, so it's practical, kind of like digital hygiene, many people call it. So, this is another question we get asked often. Given the nature of the type of research that we do at the Citizen Lab, we have to be a bit more out there in terms of digital hygiene, especially vis-a-vis some of our partners. I mean, I showed the example of Pakistan. The guy in Pakistan, the principal person that we work with in Pakistan, he's got actually his own Citizen Lab-like team there. He has faced now, since he went to Lahore High Court for the NetSweeper case, and he also went because we found Fisher command and control servers in Pakistan. And so he went to launch a court case about that. During the court case, the attorney said that he was engaging in blasphemy. And then an article started to appear about him using the same language in the tribal regions. And he started having visits from Pakistani intelligence. So the issues for him have become really dire. And in those just to give you an example of we really have to think through how we're communicating with our person there. And even for us, it's challenging, right? I think the instinct among many people is just to retreat and unplug from all of this. But I think that's not only impossible, because even if you didn't use a cell phone and you never went to an internet cafe, all of your friends do, and you use credit cards, and it's just it's like a inevitable transformation that will draw you in one way or another. Moreover, I think it's actually important and useful technology. There are many benefits from it, so we don't want to retreat. So there are various tools and technologies out there, from encryption to protect your email, and other types of, there are now secure phones out there that you can purchase that encrypt the traffic. Whatever encryption you use, whatever technology you use, however, won't ultimately protect us as a society. And that's where we need to look for non-technical solutions, particularly oversight mechanisms. So we need to ensure that, first of all, private companies are doing what they say they're doing with our data. That means actually going through or at least having somebody go through the terms of service. But also public officials, government officials, are not overstepping the limits of their authority. And I think clearly that's a question here in Canada. We just don't know. We don't have, there's like a structural flaw in the architecture of political accountability in Canada, right? It's like a design flaw. There's no oversight that's independent of our signals intelligence agency. So I know that's a long way of answering your question, but there are steps you can take, resources I could point you to that I think are useful. One other thing, while I remember, I think everyone, it's a good thought exercise to imagine shrinking down. My children, when they were very young, they used to watch a Magic School Bus, and I don't know if anyone else is familiar with that show, but it was a cartoon show. The premise was a teacher would shrink them down in the school bus, and they would go through the arteries and veins, and it would illustrate the human physiology. And I think it's useful to do a thought exercise with respect to any digital transmission that you engage in. Like, shrink yourself down, slow down time, imagine where does it go? Where does my email go? Where is the data stored? With whom is it shared? Because at the speed of light, at an instant, it's hard to imagine that even your email from Canada to the other side of the planet goes through a complex physical material infrastructure that spans many political jurisdictions. And many people have access to that data, and it doesn't necessarily disappear. Yes?
Is the BlackBerry end-to-end communication, is that the most secure?
Oh, my favorite topic, BlackBerry. So, BlackBerry, for many years, touted itself as precisely a solution for this type of person, right? Saying, our stuff, we got this secret sauce, it's so good that even we can't break it. If we wanted to, we can't do that. And I just, when I first was confronted with that, I kind of scratched my head. I said, well, how is that possible? I mean, you have to, by law, to operate in the United States, you have to be able to turn over your data to the law enforcement if they come with a warrant. So that just doesn't, and they were never giving straight answers. And it bugged me. So I started writing about BlackBerry in op-eds in the Globe and Mail and so on. Once they started getting demands from countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, starting in about 2009, and the countries were making ultimatums. Either you give us access to your data, or you can't operate in our country, plain and simple. And from what I understand, they made deals with those countries to provide a window or a backdoor for law enforcement security services in those places. Otherwise, they wouldn't be operating in them. But they've never been transparent about it. They've never come out and said exactly what's going on. They've made distinctions between their consumer-level product and the enterprise-level product. There are revelations in the Snowden documents about how the NSA subverted the standard-setting process around encryption, particularly around encryption that was patented by a company in Ontario that BlackBerry purchased and which is used in their enterprise-level systems. So that's now out in public knowledge. There was a story in the Globe and Mail, I was quoted in it, where I said, well, BlackBerry, here's the story, what is the deal? But again, they're coming out with just purely confusing responses. So bottom line is, I don't believe there is any company that if it promotes that type of wholesale security, can actually do it, especially one that is headquartered in Canada, operates in the United States, has personnel that have close associations with the National Security Agency. So to me, it's just a PR stunt, and they've been doing this. I think it's really quite shameful, actually. So I have a pet peeve against BlackBerry. Yes?
I wonder if you could focus in a little more on Snowden and his impact on U.S. politics, government reaction, and the reforms that have recently been announced by Obama. Are we, where is this going? And the fact that you mentioned that, every week there's a new revelation. 46 years we could be subjected to this, or they could be subjected to this, maybe more to the point. What does it all mean?
So I think Snowden will go down in history as provoking this debate. I think that will make him, a historical figure for that reason alone. A lot of the details of all of this were in the shadows, and I can recall giving presentations like this where I'd ask audiences, how many people have heard of CSIS? And, everyone would put up their hands, and I'd say, how about CSEC? And no one in the room would have heard about it. Now, most people do. Still some people in Canada don't, thanks to Edward Snowden. So he's sparked a conversation about things that used to happen beneath the surface that I think now desperately need to be talked about. We need a public conversation about them. In terms of whether he is a traitor, whistleblower, so on, I think given the scale of what's been revealed, to me, this is no question. He's a whistleblower. I think there is some fair question asked about whether his decision to actually leave the country and not take whatever came at him once he released the information, because that immediately casts suspicions on his intentions. And of course, that's a difficult choice for anyone to make, especially a young person. So there's that. I think that there is an unfortunate unintended consequence of the Snowden revelations with respect to a lot of what I'm talking about here, and that is it will accelerate a lot of the bad things that I've outlined in the short term. So already you can see governments around the world reacting. So imagine if you're the Prime Minister of Japan, and you are reading about this, and you maybe have an pretty good alliance relationship with the United States, but you're a little concerned after the Merkel revelations. You want to find out, are they spying on us? So the Prime Minister will turn to the Army and the intelligence agencies and say, please tell us, is the United States spying on us? And they'll say, well, to answer that question, we're going to need about $25 billion, and we're going to need this very advanced surveillance equipment. And of course, there'll be a lot of countries that will do also like the President of Brazil has done, which is come out and condemn it and then put in place a national system detached from U.S. networks, which sounds like a reasonable, rational, kind of plausible response, except that if you talk to people in civil society in Brazil like I do, they're not so happy about a lot of this, right? They're concerned about the Brazilian government spying on their own citizens, and you'll see a lot of countries now using the excuse of the Snowden revelations to build in place their own detached national infrastructure immune from U.S. spying, but which of course is more subject to domestic controls. It's easier to control a company that's in your own territory than it is a foreign company. I mean, that's one of the lessons of the NSA, after all. And then the companies like Gamma Group, their orders are going to skyrocket because, and I'm seeing it now in my research. Countries that you would just be shocked, the Ethiopias, Sudans, even Somalia, going out and purchasing high-tech surveillance equipment because it's now the thing to do. So in the short term, there are some major issues, bad things that I think are unintended consequences, I would say. Yes?
Recently Freedom House released its most recent report, and it says for the 8th year in a row, there's been greater repression essentially across the world. And in the Globe and Mail, actually, this was cited, and one of the things that this is the most worrying trend is this kind of surveillance that states are engaging in. And certainly your lecture gives a really sort of direct picture of that. But I instantly sort of think about all of the arguments that are made about the potential for greater transparency in government, and I particularly think about, there was an article in Foreign Affairs recently by Henry Farrell and Marty Finnemore, which says governments actually in this context can no longer be hypocritical. And the reason is that essentially because of all the sort of digitization of all the information of government, that actually they're subject to the kinds of links, the leaks that Edward Snowden is responsible for. And that they can no longer keep secrets as a result of this. And so there's sort of a balance between those two things. And there's definitely arguments. There's a net delusion argument, which comes out really strongly, saying that this is going to have a seriously negative effect on freedom across the world. But there's also really powerful arguments saying that actually the same forces almost will be a force for good. And I wonder where the lecture that you give in the book in many ways gives a very dire picture. But I wonder if you weigh the balance. Show not just all of these negative things on the ledger, but also the positives.
So it's an excellent question, and you touched on all the important points there. I would say, first of all, it's very hard to weigh something that we're talking about here, as if they can be put on a scale and say, okay, is it freedom versus, because life is very messy, things are very complex, and the dynamics, especially around local situations, can be very complicated. It's not even clear who's good or bad in some circumstances. People are both, right? So it's hard to say. I think it's important to underline the extent to which the very same technologies that people assume could be used for many good things, and they can be subverted and directed against them in ways that are very dire and threatening. And that's kind of part of what I aim to do and part of what our research is about. I'll give you one example. So right now there's a really important social movement globally. Many people call it digital humanitarianism. And basically this is about using social media, tools, open source platforms like Ushahidi and so on, to be able to map emergencies and crises in real time, encouraging people to upload data so that you can, make the most of aid operations and get to people who need the relief as quickly as possible. And it's extraordinary, like astonishing ingenuity, right, around this stuff. Very same platforms have been used to hold governments accountable around elections as well. And I'm very much in favor of that. However, recently I went and I looked through all of that literature and talked to a lot of people there, and it occurred to me, wow, these people have no idea, actually, of security. Like they were using it in an open-armed, kind of enthusiastic way without really understanding that the very same platforms can put themselves at risk. And I think now that's beginning to change, but we're starting to publish towards that audience, like, writing in specific journals as a way to reach those people. So I guess, ultimately for me, I do believe in the long run, we are headed in that direction where it is very difficult to hide, and we are going to be able to hold people to account in ways that we never could before. And stepping back even further, it's kind of the story of human progress, if you will. I'm ultimately an optimist. I'm a liberal, if you will, when it comes to that. But it's something that you can't take for granted, and just it's going to run by itself, because it could not end up that way either. And that's why we have to be vigilant, I think, and understand squarely what the risks are today. Because in the short term, I think things are getting a lot worse.
I think we have
Yeah? Oh, okay. Take no more, or?
Yes, I think we're a little bit past. Maybe we can take one more question.
Okay, yeah, great.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what...
The last question, so there's a big rain on your shoulder. Profound. Not the pretty impression.
What's the true motivation for our own governments to collect every byte of information that we transmit or receive? Because when I was a kid, I remember real terrorist attacks being used quite regularly from the IRA and other groups. We don't really see that now in the US. We don't see that in Canada. We don't see that in the UK. We don't see that in Europe. So what's going on? Why do they need every bit of information about all of us?
Well, I think there is a real concern about that possibility happening. I don't think we should discount it. You know, when I was going to this university as an undergrad, the big concern was nuclear weapons, right? And I still think the possibility of some kind of nuclear accident or warfare that involves nuclear weapons is very real. It's like we've kind of forgotten about it, and yet the number of actors that have access to technologies that can cause significant loss of life, like destructive capabilities, have become much cheaper and more broadly damaging over time, right? You can kill a lot more people with
Would you reasonably expect somebody planning something like that to be texting about it or tweeting about it?
Well, possibly, but what I was going to say is that those concerns exist. There is a legitimate need to defend ourselves, and you know, first of all, without law enforcement, without even military intelligence, the very rights that we are talking about here could quickly evaporate. So we do need to have in place law enforcement, agencies like that, but they need to be properly accountable. And I think that's a very important point, often lost by people who are, you know, part of my community who just wish for the state to go away and the end of the NSA. I'm not sure I'm with them to that extent. Now, you do raise a very important point, though, and I'll just make this very quick. I think there is an inertia around institutions. They start addressing a problem, and then it just develops a momentum on its own. And, of course, here in the area of security, surveillance, it's a big business. So there's a kind of self-propelling momentum to it. And billions of dollars going towards collecting ever more fine-grained pictures and details about all of us. So it's an inertia, is what I would say. But one that's definitely out of control.